Sorry, it's taking me a little bit to get everything set up. Okay. I just have to make sure it's not going to echo back at me, because when it does that, it throws me off completely. So, waiting for this final thing to set up. Okay, good. Let's share my screen. It's being live streamed. I am going to share my screen. Fatima Ira, if it causes a problem, because then the clip with my face on it won't be as large. If it causes a problem for you, let me know, and I will switch back to not sharing the text, but it's a little easier for me if I can look at the text as I'm going. Okay, and then I
can remove the text.
Oh, okay.
If you can.
Okay. If you can, then that's great. All right, fine. So last week I was trying to give a big overview, and I'm going to try to do it a little differently, perhaps for the next chapter. But for this chapter, I already did that big overview. Now we're going back. We're going to try to answer some of the questions that we asked at the beginning. So we're back here on in the beginning, and the first thing that happened is it tells us what year it was, L'malchut Yehoyakim. Everywhere else in the text, we're going to hear about what's going on in Bavel, what's going on in Persia, etc. We switch worlds. This is the only glimpse we have of what's going on in Eretz Yisrael, and it's not even such a big glimpse of what's going on in Eretz Yisrael. So I want to give you some of that background, because most of our Mefarshim say it's a real problem, this business saying it's the third year of Malchut Yehoyakim. Now, that's because they know Tanakh better than I do. All right. The reason they think it's a big problem is that elsewhere in Sefer Yirmiyah, it says it was the fourth year of Yehoyakim that Nebuchadnezzar first shows up. So how can it be in the third year that he shows up to take him away to Nebuchadnezzar? It also says that Jehoiakim was king in Jerusalem, not a king who was living out his life in prison in Bavel, but he was king in Jerusalem for 11 years. So how can it be in the third year of his reign that he ends up going to Bavel if he was in Jerusalem for 11 years? So if you know the text in Malachim, in Yirmiyah, in Divrei Yamim, then you see that this is problematic. So different people have different ways of trying to condense the timeline. The Ibn Ezra in particular tries to make it so that Nebuchadnezzar and the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's time, which perhaps starts the 70-year count for Bavel, and the Chorban happened at the same time. What he then does with not only 11 years of Yehoiakim, but an additional 11 years later on of Tzidkiyahu is a whole different question. But except for Ibn Ezra, the majority of Chazal do not try to do that. So we need to have, it's telling us that we need to have a picture of what's going on in Israel and what's going on in the larger world. That's really the first thing that this verse is telling us. And being in, the details may or may not be interesting to people. So I'm going to try to do it, some with psukim from Malachim and Divrei Yamim, and some just explaining from the outside. Prior to Yehoiakim, was a king named, actually, there were two kings prior to him. We'll go back three. The third king before him was Menashe, who was king for 45 years, most of which time the people of Yehuda had peace and quiet. Unfortunately, Menashe was a very wicked king in quite a variety of ways. Chazal asked, so how could he have such peace and quiet? Because Am Yisrael had achdut among them. And so in return for the achdut that was among them, the punishment that was megiyah to them for the things that they were doing that were not good was delayed and put off to a time when they didn't have achdut, when the evil that had been done during their time started ripping the society apart. And so the punishment for what happened was delayed. It's not that Akash Baruch Hu tells us that he visits the sins of the fathers on the children. Chazal tell us, whoa, that's only if the children repeat the sins. So immediately after him came a child who most certainly did not repeat those sins, was Yoshiyahu. Yoshiyahu becomes the king, and he finds a Sefer Torah. I mean, that's how bad things had gotten during Menashe's time, is that people weren't learning Torah at all in Eretz Yisrael, if you can imagine. And so Yoshiyahu now becomes the king, and he finds the Sefer Torah, and he cleans up the Beit HaMikdash, and he redirects the money, the Chetzi shekel to Bedek Bayit, and he redirects and he directs the people, and they celebrate a Pesach Sheni, and he also mamish cleans up. He does what Shaul HaMelech, all those many years before, almost 400 years earlier, what Shaul HaMelech had tried to do to get rid of the Yidoni and the Baal Ovot and all these kinds of soothsayers and things which are mamish asur. There's a pasuk mefurash in the Torah that tells us we're not allowed to do these kinds of things. He's one of the few who made a truly concerted effort against what are called bamot. Prior to the establishment of the Beit HaMikdash, in addition to there being a central mizbeach near the Mishkan, people were allowed essentially to have a private mizbeach. I don't know about in your backyard, but people had private mizbechot, or you had a mizbeach in the town. We hear about it with Shmuel Hanavi, that he offered sacrifices, shlamim. You're going to have a party. You could eat kadosh. You sacrificed. You had your local kohen. You sacrificed, and you ate. You gave part to the kohen and part to the Levi, and then you had your sudat mitzvah, and you were eating kedusha. It was, you were eating from a korban, and you didn't necessarily have to go to, whether it was Shiloh or wherever else the Mishkan was, you didn't necessarily have to go there to do it. You had other local spots that you could do it in. Once the Beit HaMikdash was established, we're no longer allowed to do that. And over and over and over again through Sefer Melachim, we hear that so-and-so was a good king, and he did good stuff. He followed in the footsteps of David and Shlomo, except he didn't get rid of the bamot. Over and over again, we hear that. So Yeshaya finally does get rid of the bamot just in time, because it's only about 25 years later that we get exiled to Bavel. And if we had still been in the habit of bamot and all of these other kinds of things, what was the one thing that held us together as a people in Galut? That we had a religion that was based in one particular place. It was a central place. Ideally, that had always been the idea of Yerushalayim. that Yerushalayim and the Beit HaMikdash was a place that the entire nation came together, that we came together to see and to be seen. And because of the bamot, among other things, but because of the bamot, people often, like, why should I go so far to Yerushalayim in order to be able to offer this sacrifice? I can just do it here. I don't have to go so far. And as a result, there was a lack of unity. There was a lack of unity that occurred. And so in those last 25 years, at least in terms of the religion and now, it wasn't a very portable religion in that sense, right? It would have been much more portable if we could have still just set up an altar wherever we were. Okay, Avram, we keep hearing these stories in these parshiot that we're in, right? Avram built an altar in this place, and then he went, and then he built an altar in another place, the place where God appeared to him. Okay, if we could still have been doing that, it might have allowed us to stay in touch with our religious obligations, but it would have made it totally impossible for us to hold together as a single people, because the people in this town would have that altar, and the people in that town, and the religion and the people would have become even more fragmented. So Yeshayahu puts an end to all sorts of questionable practices that were hangovers from previous times. He puts into And he puts other things into practice also. He wasn't just a good guy in terms of religion. He also tried to make some significant changes in terms of learning Torah. He tried to make significant changes in terms of the mission that we hear about in this week's Parsha, right? Where Hashem says about Abraham, I shouldn't tell him what's going on. I know about him that he's going to command his children after him to do tzedakah and mishpat. And the problem is that while Yeshayahu succeeded almost by force of arms, succeeded in imposing the Ben Adam L'Makom aspects of how we worshiped God, in imposing that on the people and getting them to finally chap that, okay, this is really what the Torah is asking of us. Some of the other things about looking out for the poor, looking out for the orphan, looking out for the ger, setting the slaves free at the Yovel, etc., that he had much more trouble getting across. And as a result, God decides that the ultimate decree against the Beit HaMikdash and of exile is not going to be indefinitely put off, but rather it kept coming closer and closer. One of the things that happened during his time, and I know I'm still back before the Sefer Daniel, but this I think is important for us to get an understanding, because this pasuk says to us, "B'shnot shalosh l'malchut Yehoyakim," and that doesn't really work, and so then that it raises questions that we need to answer. So we're still with Yeshayahu. So at that time, Bavel's not even on the world scene. The two world powers are Ashur, which is to the north of us, and Mitzrayim, which is to the south and somewhat to the east of us, to the west of us. All right. And if they want to fight each other, they have to go through us. And we're not like Switzerland, that we're entirely, Yerushalayim maybe, right, that has mountains all around it, maybe. But in general, Eretz Yisrael is not a place that's got mountains protecting it all around it. It can be sort of, and you just say to anybody who wants to go fight somebody on the other side, just go around, right? We couldn't really say that. So Paro Necho wants to go fight against Ashur. And he wants to fight up in a place called Chomat, which is actually up in what is now Lebanon. And so he wants to just go through Eretz Yisrael. He wants to go through Yehuda. And Yoshiyahu says, no, he doesn't want him to. Now, Yirmiyahu tells Yoshiyahu, you need to let him go through. Like, we are not, our standing perhaps is not so good with God. He's not going to do miracles for us that are going to allow you to turn away a world power. You have to let him go through. And he's like, no, I'm going to assert my sovereignty. And the sovereignty of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, I'm going to assert my sovereignty. And that's what he claims he's going to do. And what ends up happening, and that part of him, little boy, go home, basically. You know, this is a fight between the big guys. You don't belong here in this war. And he refuses, and he tries to close the border, and he gets killed. And so Paro Necho goes, takes care of his business with Ashur. On his way back, he appoints, there'd been another king after Yoshiyahu, one of Yoshiyahu's sons, Yehoachaz, who also decides to try to bar Paro Necho's way back home again. And he swats him out of the way also. And he says, and he appoints somebody else to be king. And it's an interesting thing. It's sort of a foreshadowing and yet different from what we hear in Sefer Daniel. He appoints Eliakim to be the king of Israel. Now, even if you know the names of all the kings of Israel, Eliakim is not the name of one of them. And in fact, he changes Eliakim's name. Paro Necho himself changes Eliakim's name to Yehoiakim. Not just God will establish, but the Yud and the Hey and the Vav, that name of God, the particularly Jewish God, is going to establish Yakim. And that's the person that he appoints as king. And that's how Yehoiakim becomes king of Israel. He basically owes his allegiance to Paro Necho. And things go on for a little while. And now Bavel comes on the world scene during Yehoiakim's time. And Bavel comes onto the world scene and they conquer Ashur. That's the first thing they do. And they're in the business of rolling back Egypt. They don't ever conquer. Bavel never actually conquers Mitzrayim, but Bavel does eventually roll Egypt back to its own borders. And Mitzrayim ceases to be a world power at that point, at least for quite a while. And they become, instead, their local power, local to themselves. And Bavel rules the rest of its known world. On the way back from doing some of this fighting, Nebuchadnezzar tells Yehoiakim, okay, I understand that you were appointed by Paro, but if you will switch your allegiance basically over to me, and if I get the taxes now instead of Paro Necho getting the taxes, then then you can stay on your throne. All is good. And he continues going back to Bavel. For 3 years, Yehoiakim, this is, according to other psukim we have elsewhere, this is approximately, Nebuchadnezzar shows up in the 4th year, whether it's that same 4th year of Yehoiakim or not, that all takes place, or whether it's another couple of years later. But at any rate, Yehoiakim agrees to serve Bavel and, i.e., pay taxes, pay tribute. And he does so for a period of 3 years. And in the 4th year, he rebels. Now, we're told that he was king for a total of 11 years. So there are about 4 years before Babel shows up. There's at least 3 years Babel. He rebels for some period of time. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babel, Yerushalayim, shows up and he besieges Yerushalayim. That's our verse. What the heck? Right? So you have to turn that somehow into 11 years because but why does it say the 3rd year? Because Nebuchadnezzar actually gave him 3 years of tax rebellion before Nebuchadnezzar decides to do something about it. And so it was in the 3rd year of renewed sovereignty, right? He's making the same mistake that his grandfather Yoshiyahu had made, which is to say, I want to assert, Jewish sovereignty in the land. And one of our Chazal tell us, I believe it was the Al-Sheikh, which is actually what I have open to the side, that on this next verse, where it says that God gave Yehoiakim into the hand of the king of Yehoiakim, who was the king of Judah, and some of the Kalim, etc., into his hand, we're always in God's hand, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. All right. And so I believe the Al-Sheikh says to us, what's that about? And the answer was, that's about trying to say to us, oh, my goodness, if God wouldn't save Yoshiyahu, who was a good king from Parunecha, how much more so is it unlikely that he's going to save Yehoiakim, whom we are told in Malachim and in Yirmiyah and in Devrei Yamim, etc., that he was a bad king, okay, that he did wrong to the people and before God. How much more so is it unlikely that God is not only not going to save him, like he didn't save Yoshiyahu, but he's going to actively arrange circumstances to handle, because that's part of the punishment that's coming. All right. And so that's what happens to continue Jewish history, just because we're not going to hear. I want you to know this couple of verses here, these first 2 verses at the beginning of Sefer Daniel, is all that we are going to hear about the history of Am Yisrael, particularly in Eretz Yisrael, but it's really all that we're going to hear about the history of Am Yisrael. The rest of what we're going to hear are glimpses, anecdotes of things that happened to court Jews, things that happened to the Jewish people as exiles in a land not their own, when they have no shemitz, no itty little bit of any kind of sovereignty at all. So all that we're hearing is just in these first 2 psukim, and then we leave Eretz Yisrael not for as long as Rahman al-Islam, the Galut, the destruction of the second temple was, but in terms of the Sefer, we completely leave Eretz Yisrael. So this is all that we have of it. And so just to tell you what then continues happening, because this Sefer will not address that, what continues happening after Yehoiakim is taken in exile. So then his son Yehoiachin becomes the king. Similar name. Yehoiachin becomes the king. He serves as king for only 3 months. Evidently, the people put him in place. He was not appointed by Babel. And evidently, Nebuchadnezzar had about as much as he was willing to have of the Jews thinking that they're in charge of themselves, the Bnei Yehuda thinking that they're in charge of themselves. And so he swoops back on Yerushalayim. He takes Yehoiachin captive, And he doesn't only take, here it says it took Jehoiakim back to Bavel. He comes back again 3 months later. He takes Jehoiachin captive. He puts his brother, whose name I don't remember what it is, and he changes his brother's name from what it was to Tzidkiyahu. Again, it's a change of a name. But notice, from Eliakim to Jehoiakim, from whatever it was, and it didn't sound at all like Tzidkiyahu to Tzidkiyahu. Name change was from one Jewish name to a different Jewish name. The names were in Hebrew. All right. The change name that we hear just in a few psukim later here in Sefer Daniel was a change of name from Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Those are names that ring true to us, to names like Belshazzar, Shadrach, Abednego, like Meshach. Those names don't even sound Jewish at all. And so there's a change of this, and not only, it wasn't just a change of name, right? Over there, we said it was he put those names on the children. Okay? And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But there's a parallel and intensification of what's going on. At any rate, Tzidkiyahu becomes king, and he's going to be king for 11 years before the Chorban. So whether Daniel shows up with Jehoiakim or whether he shows up with Jehoiachin 3 months later, it's all about the same length of time. It is 11 years before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So Daniel and his friends leave a Yerushalayim, which on the outside looks like it's a functioning city, a functioning society. They're paying taxes. You know, the king isn't the one that they chose, but he's still from the royal family. He's the one that the outside ruler chose. All right. But they were kids when they left. How much do they know about the ins and outs and intricacies of the politics, etc.? They left a society where there was a Beit HaMikdash and there was no Avodah Zorah. Not on the streets anyway, right? They left, and that's the Yerushalayim that they have imprinted on their brain. I was zocha last week to be in the Rova with Rivka Lewis, who stopped me as we were overlooking the Kotel and Har HaBayit. We were, still up above before we'd gone down to the level of the Kotel, and we could see the south side of the wall of Har HaBayit as well. And she, using her holy imagination, and tried to awaken my holy imagination to think of what it's going to look like. But that's what Daniel and his friends have in their minds. They come from Yerushalayim. They saw they had been able to be at the Beit HaMikdash for the morning sacrifice, for the afternoon sacrifice. They lived there. That was their home. That was what they saw. And that was what they were taken away from. And even though there was other stuff going on in the society that was not great and was not getting fixed, that's they have when they think of home and when they think of Yerushalayim, because they had actually seen it. All right. At any rate, Jehoiachin gets taken back and he gets put in jail. We're told at Mamish at the very end of Sefer Malachim that in the 37th year of his exile, he is set free by Evel Merodach, who is a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. It's after Nebuchadnezzar is no longer king. But that's like mamish fast forwarding. So at any rate, Daniel and his colleagues, his friends, and a whole bunch of other people called the Cheresh and the Masger the part of society that makes society run, the high level functionaries and the bureaucrats and the nobility, etc., are brought into exile. Yehoiachin himself is in jail there for a long period of time, and Bavel is going to rule. The Beit HaMikdash stands for another 11 years. Okay. And then God gives, right? And so on this business of he came, I was going to bring you something from the Al-Sheikh, but I think I'm not going to bother with that right at the minute. Okay. And God gives Yehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And we have this business of he brings some of the kelim of the house of God. Here it says Beit Elokim. In Malachim, it's called Beit Hashem. Okay, in other words, of the Beit HaMikdash, and he brings them to Eretz Shinar. Ramat Valley says to us, Na'ar, it's a place where people shake off, can shake off the klipa, but unfortunately are more likely to try to shake off their responsibilities towards God. And that's right. It was the place of Migdal Bavel we heard about in the parsha just a couple of weeks ago. And he takes it Beit Elohav. Now in Divrei Yamim, it tells us that he took it to his heichal, to his palace. He didn't take it to his, doesn't say there that he took it to a temple, a place of worship. On the Pshat, it sounds like he took it to a place of idol worship. We saw that the Ramat Valley actually says he took it to a place which he made, it was a beit, and he says it as Elokav. In other words, there's a hint from Ramat Valley that Nebuchadnezzar, although in general is a pretty bad guy, that he was also a very smart person. Everybody agrees on that. And that there was a desire in him to do tshuva. There was a desire in him. He actually saw himself as a shaliach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so perhaps what he did, according to Ramat Valley, if you just read between the lines there, he doesn't say it explicitly, but perhaps what he did was he created a place to showcase these kelim from the Beit HaMikdash, which was also, a place for the worship of Hashem. All right, but it was just Elokav. It wasn't the God of the people of Bavel. He does not in any way, we don't even see that he necessarily attempts. We do see over and over again that he attempts to bring the worship of HaKadosh Baruch Hu at least into some kind of parity with the worship of the various idols. And we're going to hear about that through the stories. It's actually something that repeats for us. And then the kelim he even eventually takes out of this place, and he brings them to a treasury and he puts them away because, now, if you're reading it, would say sort of Lagunai in a disparaging way towards Nebuchadnezzar. So you say, well, he knew about Yirmiyahu's nevuah, that there were going to be 70 years. And so he set them aside so that they would be there 70 years later. And if that nevuah didn't come true, they would be there for others to use, but he wasn't going to use it. It could be, if you read it with some of the hints from Ramat Valley and a couple of the others, it could be that he takes it to a place and that he realizes that for him to use the kelim that belong to HaKadosh Baruch Hu would be me'ilah, and that he doesn't want to do that. Okay. But he doesn't want to leave those kelim in Yerushalayim for the Jews to use to try to gain zchut and merit. Right. So that's the setting of the scene. That's where Sefer Daniel is starting out. And it gives us a beginning of some insight to this personality of Nebuchadnezzar, because in the beginning parts of the book, the two main personalities that we meet are Daniel himself and Nebuchadnezzar. So we went on and we said, no, so were there any other questions? There were other questions that I had originally asked on those first two psukim, but are there any other questions that anybody particularly wanted me to answer, or something that came up to you before I move off of the first two psukim? Anyone? Okay. So the next few psukim, we have the king speaking to Ashpenaz, the head of the eunuchs, the head of his servants, whatever it is, to bring from among the Bnei Yisrael, Zera Melucho Mina Partamim. There's almost nobody here taking this set of classes who was with me in Elul. So I'm going to repeat something that I taught in Elul. In Masechet Sanhedrin, Tzadi Gimel, they're going through various medrash stuff. They come to the verse, actually in Megillat Ruth, but it connects. It really does connect. Okay, they come to this verse in Megillat Ruth, which says, that's the question. It says that Boaz gave her 6 seeds. Now, 6 seeds, it's not even a handful. I mean, think about it. 6 seeds wouldn't even fill up my hand. It's not even a mouthful. That, they say, is ridiculous. Well, maybe he gave her 6 measures, right? That's another interpretation. 6 seah of seeds. Well, except that 6 seah is a huge amount. It's not an amount that she could have carried home. Like 6 seah also doesn't really make any sense. So at a deeper level, the Gemara says, oh, let me darshan it out a different way. What does it mean he gave her 6 seeds? We talk about Zerah and Nash, right? Human seeds. Gave her 6 very, very special offspring who had, each one of whom had 6 very, very special characteristics. And who are these 6 offspring? The first one is David, who is praised in 6 different ways. And the Gemara lists them. Now, if it's David, you'd think it would also be Shlomo, except evidently there isn't a single verse about Shlomo that also gives a list of 6 things. The next one is Mashiach. Well, between David and Mashiach, like who else counts? The other 4 are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Okay, the 4 Jewish protagonists of our story. And they are, in fact, in this next verse, here are the 6 very special characteristics that they have. Ein behem kol mum, 1. Tovei mareh, 2. Maskilim b'kol chachma, 3. Yod'ei da'at, 4. Mivinei mada, 5. V'asher koach behem la'amod behechal hamelach, 6. They have these 6 special characteristics. They are of the Zera Melucha. In other words, what is Zera Melucha? Ruth is called Aim L'Malchut. Okay, Ruth is the mother of Malchut, and these 4 boys, okay, these 4 boys are in fact from Zera Melucha. And so they are related to the king. They are presumably, they are descendants of Ruth. Okay, descendants of David and Melech probably also, but the point is that they are descendants of Ruth Aim Malchut. That's what it means. And is there anything else that I wanted to bring you on that verse? Not so much. There was a discussion that, just paying attention to the words, that B'nai Yisrael, that you might, I'd said, maybe you should have done this in a different order. This is something that was brought up by one of the other Mefarshim, reading it on a much kind of level. B'nai Yisrael is a very large category. The Partamim are the serving nobility. Okay, not necessarily from the royal family itself, but the Partamim, it's a Persian word actually, but we hear it also in the Megillah. The Partamim are the king's ministers, etc., but not necessarily from his immediate family. So it should have been B'nai Yisrael, Mina Partamim, and then Zera Melucha. I want these people that I'm going to be training. And this, I think I spoke about it a little bit last week, this notion of taking young hostages from the royal family of an opposing or neighboring tribe, kingdom, whatever, and raising them in your court, so that they owe you some degree of loyalty, but at the same time, because of their yichus and because of their birth circumstances, they will be acceptable as envoys, rulers, mashpi'im, right, influential people in their own nation. And at the same time, they'll it's like the notion of a fifth column today, but this was something that was very common. One of the Sfarim I had pointed out that Agrippus, who was one of the last rulers in Yerushalayim before the time of the Chorban, etc., that he had been raised in. He has this name. It was not uncommon for young people to be taken, to be raised in a foreign nation, to be able to understand the ways of the foreign nation as well as to understand their own people's ways, and to serve as a bridge between the two cultures. And so this is a type of the English is escaping me, but it's a type of policy. All right. Nebuchadnezzar probably was not the first one to come up with the idea. And he is, to some extent, that's what Moshe was. I don't think that was Paro's idea. I'm not even sure that it was Bat Paro's idea that by raising a Jewish child in Paro's palace, that he would be able to serve as a bridge between the two cultures. But I think maybe that was God's idea. And so here again, we have that. Now, on these list of, so the question was asked, at any rate, the question, I think it was the Al-Sheikh who asked it, may have been the Chida, anyway, asked why did Mina Partamim come at the end instead of in the middle? I'm not sure, I don't actually really remember the answer. I just remember the question. Okay, and to explain the question a little bit, fine. This now, Yiladim asher ein behem kolmu, etc. So I found some lovely things about that. First of all, this word Yiladim. What does it mean to be a Yelad? The Gemara discusses this in Masechet Chulin, of all things, because they were talking over there. They're talking about when does a Kohen or a Levi graduate from childhood to adulthood and is old enough to be able to serve, and then, as long as they're at it, they talk a little bit about when is a child old enough to be able to serve as a shliach tzibur, and they get in. It's the Gemara. It does all sorts of different kinds of questions. There are a couple of things that one that I just thought was kind of cute. One definition of what it means to no longer be a Yelad is when you are coordinated enough that you can stand on one leg and lift up the other foot and take off the shoe and put on the shoe. And a friend of mine looked at me and said, I can't do that. Does that mean I'm still a kid? I'm like, well, it's okay. The Gemara actually also sort of alludes to the fact that maybe that's not the best of all ways to determine if somebody is a child or not a child, because it has one of the sages who's in his 80s say, I'm 80 years old and I can still do that, because of course the fact is that as we get older, we start to lose some of our flexibility, and we may no longer be able to do those things that we were able to do in our young adulthood. And so the Gemara eventually gives other definitions, but that I thought was a very sweet definition of what it means to no longer be a child. When you have control over your body. And we're going to see that, in fact, that's how elsewhere, that's how Chazal understand this business of being able to stand, right? The koach behem lamod behechal hamelach is that in Sanhedrin that was brought, and the definition there to be able to have this strength to stand in the court of the king meant that they needed to be able to hold themselves back from laughing if they hear a joke. Right? They need to be able to hold themselves back from talking to people. That's why I said last week, it sort of reminds me of the guards at Buckingham Palace. They need to be able to put off their own bodily needs and not go to the bathroom if they're on duty for 12 hours. Too bad, right? Certainly you can't hiccup or make other kinds of passing gas things in the court. They need to have control over their body. The Gemara in Sanhedrin also says that they can't get too bad if you're sleepy. You need to stay alert, right? Can't fall asleep at your post. And so that's what it meant, that they should have the koach in them to be able to stand in Heichal. On the other hand, the Noam Magadim, which is a Sefer of Chassidut, he has a very sweet thing about this pasuk. What does this mean, that they had no mum? And he says they had no mum means they had no gaiva. They had no arrogance. And what does it mean? And because they had no arrogance. Okay, so that's what gave them the koach la'amod behechal hamelach. Because not la'amod behechal melech Nebuchadnezzar, the echo that we hear in the Sefer Daniel, and just because of the time frame and the place it's setting, you always want to think about, at least I always find myself thinking about Daniel, and which is at the beginning of the exile to Bavel, and Esther, which is near the end of the exile in Bavel, or the complete exile to Bavel, right? And so there in Megillat Esther, everywhere where it says ha without any name attached to it, it's referring to Kadosh Baruch Hu. And the Noam Megadim goes on and he says about this business of that's why they had koach behem la'amod behechal hamelech. Which melech? Malkol shel olam, Kadosh Baruch Hu. Because there's a pasuk from Yeshayahu where it says, Eshchon v'at teche v'shefel ruach. I will dwell and you are low of spirit. It does not mean that you are depressed. Okay? Holding shefel ruach means I can have a ruach of gasut, of vulgarity, of look at me, I'm so great. Okay. And if I make myself big, if I fill up the whole room with me, there's no room for Kadosh Baruch Hu. There's no room for anybody else. There's no room even for another human being. All I can see is myself, right? And if I can push down on my own, the sense of ruach, my own, not on my sense of self, I still have to know who I am, all right? But if I can like hold in my own wind, okay, not be long-winded, sorry, I'm taking up almost an hour of your time, but not to be so long-winded, not to be so bombastic, etc. Then there's room for others. And then there's room for who to come and to dwell with you also. And so that's the point that the Noam Gadim is making for us, is that Nebuchadnezzar, or God, right, wanted these children who were just starting on their way, but who weren't in their way. They weren't in their own way. They had space to learn. They had space to let others come and have an influence with them, etc. And that's what's on here. Nebuchadnezzar is looking not just that they should look beautiful, okay, that they should appear. Notice it's not Yefei Mar'eh. We talked about this a little bit in terms of questioning what does the phrase mean. Tovei Mar'eh. They were seen to be good. Okay, Gutza Neshamas. And maskilim b'kol chachma yodei da'at mevinei mad'a chachma bina da'at. Okay, that these are the higher sfirot, right? They had totally open curiosity. The Bnei Yisachar says that because they were prepared for this in this way. So then they were able, okay, he says, L'chachniah hadat b'habinah shel haklipa, which was found there. They were able, and that they're going to be confronted with, because they're going to be confronted with Nebuchadnezzar, who's brilliant and is coming from a totally different place, because he is a very arrogant person. All right. And they're going to be able, as it were, to conquer him. All right. I have 6:37, which is probably really 6:40, because this computer, for some reason, keeps changing time on. So I think I have 5 minutes more. All right. So the Gemara in Ch1 said something more that I want to talk about, this business, both this business of teaching them Sefer Lashon Kasdim, and then besides the thing that it talked about, what does it mean to be a Yeled? Okay, and then also we hear in the next pasuk, we hear that the king apportioned for them, in the matters of food, things, each day in its own day, from the pat bag of the king, and from the wine, mishtav, in order that they should grow, to support them for the next 3 years. So that place in Ch1 was talking about the issue with Levim. When did they come into their service? And in one place it says when they're 25, and in another place it says when they're 30. So which one is it? And Chazal's answer is, at 25 they start their apprenticeship. At 30 they actually start their service. And so it takes 5 years to learn. From that, we have a very interesting pitgam, very interesting sort of folk saying, Talmudic saying, which is that a student, Talmid she'eino רואה סימן יפה למשנתו 5 שנים, שוב אינו רואה. A student who doesn't see progress, a good sign, siman yafa, in his learning in the course of 5 years, he's not going to. And this is used by Chazal as a way to allocate limited funds and as a way to give advice to people. If you put 5 years into learning a new career, into learning something, into trying to develop some aspect of your talents, and you don't see any siman yafa. Now, that doesn't mean that in 5 years you should become an absolute expert. Although it was pointed out to me that Maxwell Gladwell, wrote Blink, and he wrote some other books of interest, says that it takes about 10,000 hours to become an expert at something. So working 8-10-hour days, 5 years will give you your 10,000 hours. Okay. About 2,000 hours a year for 5 years gives you your 10,000 hours. You can become an expert. Either you have become an expert or you're not going to become an expert. It doesn't mean that you've reached the height of your powers. It doesn't mean that you've developed as much as you're ever going to develop. Artists remain trying to come and to become an artist over and over and over again. That's certainly true. Talmidei Chachamim, it should be chadash. It should be new for you. You're not the same person today that you were yesterday, much less the person you were 5 years ago. But if you're trying for something and you're seeing no success at the end of 5 years, it's a pretty good sign that you should choose something else to be successful at, because you will be successful at something. And in terms of a society that only has a limited amount of resources to go around to support people, it makes sense. Give them 5 years in all sorts of things. It's true that we often give 6 years before making the tenure decision in universities, but really by the end of the 5 years, they should be able to tell you if they think that next year you're likely to get tenure or not, so that you have a year or two to go look for your next job, because you either are going to make it here in this place or you're not going to make it here in this place. And we don't just keep you hanging on, if it doesn't seem that there's any likelihood of success. And of course, there are wonderful stories that, of people who try and finally, after many years, finally have success. And I'm not putting that down, but this is a pitgam from the Gemara. And then the Gemara goes on and says, no, Rabbi Yossi says it only after 3 years. Don't invest 5 years. Only invest 3 years. If you don't see siman yafa, you're not making progress within the 3 years, give that up, move on to something else. And why does he say 3 years? And he bases it here because the king said, L'gadlam shalosh shanim, shanim shalosh, 3 years. Okay? And Chazal's answer to him is, you're talking about learning the language of the costume. That's easy compared to learning Torah. So that only took 3 years, but to learn the Torah, to learn how to relate to the job of a Levi in the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash, that takes 5 years. Okay, so they argue about it and they bring our pasuk, and it's an interesting thing. Okay, I am now out of time. So we're going to pick up with this whole business of the pat bag and Daniel's response and the getting of the other names. I've sort of given you a little bit of glimpses of what it's going to be. And that's what we're going to do next week. Does anybody have any questions, either over the material that I did this time or questions that they would like answered on the upcoming psukim? In the meantime, I can stop my share if I can figure out how to do that. Maybe. who want to stop the share. Oh, here's the stop share button. There we go.
That's it.
Okay. Questions? Anyone?
Okay.
Okay. So if there are no questions, please feel free to write to me. I should be able to, with any luck, I should be able to add this to the playlist that you've already received. And this will be up, and I will send some kind of, hi, Shabbat V'chal, I'm so glad that you came. Okay. And I'm just down the street from you. I may stop and wave hello on my way to my next shiur. Okay. And then I'm going to go. By the way, I'm supposed to give a plug. I'm done teaching. Anybody who wants to say goodbye can go say goodbye. I'm supposed to have given a plug for Simchat Shlomo. If you have the resources either to make a donation through PayPal, or if you see me, to give me money that I can give to Yeshivat Simchat Shlomo, or to buy one of the punch cards and then mark off on the punch card, whatever works for you. Okay, that's business. And that's that. And yeah, that's what it is. Okay. Laila Tov, thank you so much.